Hello, good day everyone. Welcome to the first tutorial video on Psychotherapy 1. I'll be taking history of Psychotherapy 1. Now, from the introduction from the lecturer, we got that this course is actually a combination of two more courses that have come to make up one, which is why our history today would be more directed towards history of counseling psychology and those important events that have come to shape psychotherapy as we know it. So for all that and more, let's get right into the topic for today. Now, the historical development of counseling psychology as we know it is not straightforward like that of the history of psychology. It includes basically a series of events that now led to the eventual development of the discipline as an applied branch of psychology. So it was not like they actually sought out this discipline out of psychology, but then after a number of events and after a number of findings crucial to um, psychology, we found out that counseling psychology could also play a role in the whole grand scheme of things. Now, these events have been divided into two parts. We have the antecedent event and then the current event. Now, the antecedent events are a couple of notable events that during the growth of psychology, you know, coincidentally, hence the name, led to the development of counseling psychology and psychotherapy as we know it. So these antecedent events are now further divided into three sub-timelines. We have the scientific and research development, the development of assessment techniques, and the development of treatment techniques. Now, let's go further to defining the events that make us these three, or that makes up these three sub-timelines. Now, for antecedent events, like we said before, we have scientific and research development, development of assessment techniques, and development of treatment techniques. So our first sub-timeline is the scientific and research development, which basically describes the hallmark where people decided to find the explanations to phenomenon and try to employ science. So empiricism, determinism was employed during this time, and that phenomenon could be describable by taking the factors that make up this event into case. Now, the first event in this sub-timeline is the establishment of Wundt's laboratory in 1879. Now, William Wundt at the University of Leipzig uh, established the first laboratory of experimental psychology as we know it, that sought to use introspection as a way of viewing the human mind. Now, some of his contemporaries, including Edward Thorndike and Granville Stanley, all later, you know, propelled the development of the discipline and made it into something that it is widely known as today. Edward first described the human experiences in the sense of images, dreams, and themes. So it was like a flow, and then that needed to be described. Now, during the era of, or during the short timeline of scientific and research development, we found the formulation of journals to be very helpful because it helped authors postulate their theories and then emphasize it across the globe. So I could find a theory here in America, and then through my journal, people are able to test for its validity and its reliability across the seas. Now, the first journal in our records here is the American Journal of Psychology by Granville Stanley Hall. Now, Sir Granville Stanley Hall was a contemporary of Wundt, who later became the first president of the American Psychological Association, as we know it now. Now, Hall's publication of the American Journal of Psychology was mainly on developmental topics, but then started the tradition of journals in America, as we know today. And then we have the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1906 by Martin Prince, the Psychology Clinics in 1907 by Leiter Whitmer, and then the Journal of Consulting Psychology by the Association of Counseling Psychologists, then the Journal of Clinical Psychology in 1945. Now, these journals, although are identified by their date, all had different unique topics that they brought about that led to the development of counseling psychology as we know it. Like I said before, American Journal of Psychology by Stanley All help us emphasize uh, what exactly happens in our developmental timeline, and then shared of stories, especially towards adolescent development, the famous storm and stress theory and the likes, and then Journal of Abnormal Psychology measuring facts and findings on psychopathology as of during that time, and then psychology clinics by Leiter Whitmer to help with his formulated lab in that time, and then that. So then we move on to the development of assessment techniques. The development of assessment techniques, basically this sub timeline just measures or just constitutes different attempts at evaluating the individual differences in every human being. Now, we know that psychology believes in the individual differences, and it is the bedrock for most of all our theories. But then it would not make so much sense if we believe in something we could not measure, then it should not be scientific. So this was taken note of uh, by many authors during their time, and then they began to expressly work towards, you know, identifying and evaluating these individual differences. Now we have Sir Francis Galton in 1869, who was well known for his publication on the cognitive aspects of geniuses and their reaction time, which is, as he described, the average time it takes for a person to complete a cognitive task, the average time it will take for a stimulus to be converted into an action or a reaction. James Cattell was also influenced by Galton's work on cognitive processes and delved right into it in 1890. Now, as we know, uh, periods of the war and um, periods of changes in history led to the development of many other tests. Now we have the Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon intelligence test in 1905. The authors sought out to measure the intelligence of uh, children to help them better describe their performance in school, and then so on. And then we have the alpha beta test and the personnel data sheet, which was during the First World War, where the goal was to create the ultimate soldier, create a soldier that was resistant to shell shock, as what the personnel data sheet was made for, and then a soldier that was quite vast in taking instructions and giving out instructions and controlling the battlefield with the alpha and beta test. So during 1915 to 1918, this test really evaluated each soldier based on their abilities and what they can do. Now, Terman in 1916 re-evaluated Binet and Simon's test in 1905, and then gave it a new look with the aspect of IQ, which is the intelligence quotient. He introduced the intelligence quotient, and then intelligence testing evolved through that process. Now we have other attempts at uh, measuring individual differences. We have the Rorschach in-blood test in 1921, where Rorschach used in-blood tests on paper to test for internal uh, abilities of people, internal processes of his participant. Then we have the Bender Gestalt visual motor test formulated by Letta Stater Bender in 1939, and then we have the Wechsler-Bellevue intelligence test by Adam Wechsler in 1939 also, and then we have the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, MMPI, in 1942. In the same regard, we have the Olmsted neuropsychological assessment battery in 1947, a standard for development and use of psychology tests in 1945 was then created to help guide the process of, developing psychological tests along the line, because there was now a need to have a standardized procedure. There was a need to consider ethics. There was a need to consider target population and all other factors that would make up a psychological test. Now, moving on to the third sub timeline, we have the development of treatment techniques. Now, during this time was the evolution of how people living with a mental disorder were being treated like patients. So this was the evolution of treatment. So in this timeline, we have first the unchaining of inmates at the La Bicentre Asylum in Paris by Philippe Pinel in 1793. And Philippe Pinel evaluated the way asylums were, and then realized that people with mental disorders were treated in a way that was closely related to prisoners, convicted prisoners, because they were in chains and then the environment was unsanitary, the treatment to these people was inhumane. So the unchaining of inmates was a pivotal process in changing the healthcare system for mental disorders, and taking up this great work was William Tooke, a British, I'd like to say, philanthropist who created an estate known as the York Retreat. Clean environment, safer bedrooms, no chains, just for the amelioration of people living with a mental disorder. And then we have Madame Dorothea Dix in 1840. Now, from 1840 to 1880, Madame Dorothea Dix carried out what we know as the 40-year campaign, where she traveled around the states of the United States to evaluate their asylums, their prisons, and write to government officials and people in charge of policies on how they can re-evaluate the conditions of these facilities, better changes, more redefinition in their processes, and every other thing that would make more sense in treating the mentally disabled or the mentally ill. Now, then we move to the actual treatment procedures. Now, during the late 1890s or the early 1890s, the late 18th century, the late 19th century, we had an outbreak of hysteria. Not more of an outbreak, but then hysteria was a common mental disorder that was diagnosed in that period. And then people like Murray Bernheim used hypnosis as a method of treatment. Now, hypnosis, as they described it, was a subjective state where the brain is, or where the mind is open to suggestions. So hypnosis was a process where they would induce a suggestive state that would allow the physician or the doctor suggest method of amelioration to the patient. And then we move on to the big man behind the whole treatment procedures and behind what we know as the psychoanalysis movement, Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud at first also used hypnosis, but then delivered and went into the treatment process by also postulating what we know as psychoanalysis movement, which was basically saying that we could better treat these people by going or by exploring the internal conflict between the structures of the mind, which he identified as the conscious, the preconscious, and the subconscious. And then in this, in our unconscious, are three other bodies: the the ego, and the superego, constantly fighting for attention, or constantly resurfacing into our conscious and expressing their demands, and the ego, being the mediator between them, have certain defense mechanisms that might come off as maladaptive, and then the psychosexual stages, which we've been taught since the very first time of our approach in psychology. Now we move to current events. Now, current event doesn't really mean these events are up to date, but these are, it refers to happenings that were closely tied to the development of counseling psychology as we know it. So these events were found as a close relation to counseling psychology as a course. Now, some of them were shaped by the antecedent events that we mentioned earlier, but they came uh, they came closely, or they came closer to counseling psychology than others did. Now, Whitmer created the first psychological clinic in 1879, redefining treatment procedures further, and then uh, with his journal, he was able to postulate the findings that his clinic found. And then the first American Association of Clinical Psychologists by letter starter all in board in 1917. Now, in a few years after, I think 2 years after, in 1919, the APA then created its own division of clinical psychologists. James Markin Cattell in 1921 established what is known as the Psychological Corporation. They were involved with publications regarding counseling psychology, textbooks, journals, and all that stuff. But then they came to be later known as the Accord Assessment in 2014, and then after as the Pearson Assessment. So currently, we don't have the psychological conclusion anymore. We don't have the Accord Assessment anymore. We now have the Pearson Assessment. Now, publication of psychological textbook in 1936, which was titled Clinical Psychology, a Handbook of Children's Behavior by Petit Chauncey, was also one of the great landmarks in counseling psychology as we know it, because it led to the acknowledgement of clinical psychology in the US alongside other events in 1936 by the state of Virginia, and then national acknowledgement now began in 1947. And then we now had the American Board of Examiners in Professional Psychology to certify professional psychologists, give them the ability to open a clinic and sort. So now, so far, we've discussed how it happened in other parts of the world. Let's now bring it down to our own very own nation, Nigeria. Now, the first record of clinical psychology, or the first record of Association of the Clinical Psychologists, was in 1979 in Benin City by Professor Alfred Awari Tefel, creating the Nigeria Association of Clinical Psychologists, NACP. Now, the association did wonderful work and then published the Nigerian Journal of Clinical Psychology, where Nigerian clinical psychologists expressed their ideas and new findings and more culturally informed ethics and all that stuff. So in 1995, the Nigerian Society of Psychotherapy, which apparently was affiliated to the International Federation of Psychotherapy in Germany, was created. So the NSP takes in member psychologists, educationists, nurses, and other professionals that were somehow interested in psychological care, which was different from that of NACP, where the minimum or uh, the basic certification for entry was a master's degree in psychology or guidance and counseling. Now, in 2003, at Abuja, Andrew Zamani established the Association of Practicing Psychologists, and then so on and so forth. We've started to see a change in how Nigeria evaluates psychologists and then how Nigeria takes in psychologists, and then due to new methods of awareness, new methods of public enlightenment, we're seeing that Nigerians are beginning to embrace psychotherapy, and it will soon, as per projections by the officials, that it will soon be a registered profession in Nigeria with you know more certification needed to practice. Now, with all that and more, we've come to the end of the history of psychotherapy. One, I hope you've enjoyed it, but it would help if you are able to take this thing into account. Now, if you feel that I've made some mistake in any of the dates, please refer to your book or textbook for more ideas. Now, for our assessment, try to narrate uh, the development of psychology using the three sub-timelines and the antecedent events and the current events. See if you can tell it to your 4-year-old, 5-year-old, or 7-year-old at home, and then you would have achieved optimal retention by that time, according to Fairman. So, thank you for listening, and goodbye.